At that point, I actually forgot because as I was reading it, I was thinking, well, plants aren't very good at that.
We all know the truth. More connects us than separates us. But in times of crisis, the wise build bridges, while the foolish build barriers.
You raise walls, I destroy them. Let's see who prevails.
Just because something works doesn't mean that it cannot be improved.
I say we take off and nuke the entire site from orbit. It's the only way to be sure.
Allow my sword to join you in the fight against evil.
The world needs us to chase dreams.
We have to dedicate ourselves each and every single day to this fight because I can't do it alone.
You, the people, have the power to create machines, the power to create happiness. You, the people, have the power to make this life free and beautiful, to make this life a wonderful adventure. Then in the name of democracy, let us all unite!
Welcome to the Skiffy and Fanty Show. I'm Trishi Matson.
I'm Brandon O'Brien.
And I'm Daniel Hauser.
And today we are talking about a collection of short stories called A Larger Reality, Speculative Fiction from the Bicultural Margins for our Reading Rangers Shorts podcast. This project was inspired by the Mexicanics initiative of John Picacio, 13 stories by Mexican or Mexican-American people. The EPUB is available for free download, and that address will be in the show notes. But if you search, listeners, for Mexicanics Initiative online, you should be able to find it. So, 13 stories in this collection. Do you all want to just talk about general impressions first and then dive into individual notes?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so I guess I'll start. It was a pretty quick read. A couple of the stories I went back and read a couple of times because they were challenging. Other stories were just light fun, but I definitely think it's worth checking out.
I definitely agree. I agree, especially with your note that a lot of these stories are very quick and fun and snappy, but they're also really engaging and meaningful, even in their kind of fun and semi-escapism at some points. One of the things that I thought was actually really neat about some of these stories is that they have views of how the future will affect certain groups of people that are very deliberately shaped by socio-political events that are taking place in the here and now, but under the kind of presumption that things like the border wall are just a small example of larger sociological issues that Hispanic communities will have to deal with in a future where those things persist.
Yeah, so I agree with what was said, and from a personal perspective, I went in expecting to think it was okay, but I didn't have huge expectations from it. And as I got into it, I got more and more excited to read more of it. Partially, I guess, because it is sort of a quick read, yet has a lot of depth there within it. And then, in addition, I appreciated a lot just the fact that it's more science and speculative fiction in translation that's available. And so, as the co-host of that podcast with Rachel, I was particularly drawn to it just from that aspect of having access to literature that otherwise we might not be able to get in English, of having those translations available. But then this collection, it's also cool because it's available then in Spanish as well. And so some of the stories were written in Spanish and translated into English, and then some kind of then were translated in the reverse direction, so written in English originally and then translated into Spanish. So I thought that was a cool way of going about this. And in the end, I just adored how varied the stories ended up being. But really good quality.
Yes, definitely quite a range in the stories that we saw. I guess I should mention that there is one story that didn't make it into the e-edition that they recommend. There are instructions on the website for where to find that other story, Atrapadas en la Escuela. So if you're interested, listeners, you can find that other story online also.
And one story is also a comic.
Oh,
and
right.
on mine, at least, there was nothing there that I could tell.
Oh.
So maybe it was from being in the Mobi, or it was kind of slow in responding on my Kindle. But I didn't end up really getting to see that. So
Okay, I did have some issues trying to read the EPUB on my phone, and so I just gave up and read it online on my browser on my desktop. So if you check back there, you should be able to find the comic, hopefully. Brandon, did you get a chance to see the comic?
I unfortunately also did not.
Okay, well, I guess I get to give a solo review on that. And I'll just go ahead and start with that one, although it's at the end of the book. And apologies in advance for any mispronunciations I may give for authors or titles. The comic was actually called Rhizome, which should strike a chord with Daniel.
Oh, yes, it did. That's why I was so disappointed not to see it.
Creators are listed as Libya Brenda, who is the editor-in-chief of this collection, and Richard Zala is the other creator listed. And it is a short and fairly simple little comic, mostly blue, black, and white, if I recall correctly. And it's about a reporter interviewing a science fiction writer who has been writing for many years. And he shows her his tattoo of a blue tulip that he was inspired by one of her stories, and he says he looked all over the world for it and, studied botany as well as English because of that. And she reveals to him that that was actually a real plant from the future, and she's a time traveler, and she tells him how he can travel too. It's just a sweet little story. And the rhizome of the title refers to how time travels back and forth and networks and keeps expanding its network, if I'm understanding correctly.
Oh, cool. A wonderful biological metaphor. Okay, I need to go look that up.
And then I guess we can jump back up to the beginning of the collection. And that story was Fences by Jose Luis Zarate, translated by Joey Whitfield. Would either of you like to volunteer for a summary?
This one stuck out to me right from the get-go because it opens in a really sort of descriptive passage of a magician reaching into a hat to pull out a rabbit, but getting basically bit and having to snap the neck of the rabbit. And so it's a very graphic, but also sort of in some ways like humorous, like odd take on it that you wouldn't be expecting, and it kind of sets the tone for the story that in a way that I liked. And so what the story is about is this American who is now stuck in, if I recall, it's almost like a post-apocalyptic kind of thing where it's a near future, but there is now a fence or a walled border, which should be familiar, as Brendan was saying, due to current socio-political events of talks about a border wall being up between the United States and Mexico. So there is now this heavily regulated border between the nations, and this American has now become stuck on the Mexican side, even though they are American originally, and so they are making their way, traveling with a carnival or circus as a magician. Doesn't speak too much Spanish, but now has been bitten and effectively is worried about having gotten rabies from the rabbit bite. So starts then basically on a journey, as it were, a mini journey to get treated for this potential rabies bite, and potentially going back to sort of the United States and the resources that might be available to him there as a United States citizen. And ultimately, the story ends up really being just about a concept that resonated with me as somebody who has lived and traveled abroad, of you start sort of feeling like you're not really a citizen of any particular country, or you might feel caught between two worlds. And so right from the get-go, I think the story sets up a recurring theme in the collection that sort of tries to falsify binary identities. And so this character in some way has a connection now to Mexico, but isn't quite at home there, but at the same time is now no longer welcome back quite right in the United States either. And so doesn't really feel like an American either.
Right. If I recall correctly, at the end of it, when he makes it to the border, he is unable to understand the border guards
right.
Because
things have changed.
That maybe the language has changed a little bit, or he was never properly taught by his American parents, who had also been trapped over there.
Right.
I was interested by his friend driving him around, volunteering to, and they leave the carnival to try and get him to medical care in time, and just the descriptions of driving around in the empty land, because the walls that they built, from the descriptions, it sounded like they were not just physical walls, but kind of force fields too, or something, and...
Yeah.
So there was also massive ecological damage around the walls, too.
Which resonates with, the concepts of even just the simplest description of the wall that might be politically proposed has drastic consequences for sort of like the ecology beyond just human ecology.
Right. So, as you said, a near future story that it's more sociological science fiction or, political science fiction than, it's very near future. It wouldn't take much tweaking at all for that to become a kind of reality.
Mm-hmm.
And so we never find out if he has rabies. That's not really important. That's just kind of the kickoff for the story as they go on this journey.
Mm-hmm. Because essentially the thing that we're supposed to learn from the process of that story is how other things have changed rather than how the protagonist is potentially ill or potentially not ill. That's just a vehicle for us to explore exactly what about the world that he's in is just a little bit different than ours.
Right.
And that he was born in himself in some ways. Or that was just before he was born.
So, the next story also involves a border wall. This story is Aztlan Liberated by David Bowles. But the walls here are not exactly for the same reason. This is an alien invasion by space aliens, or rather than illegal immigrants that the United States was worried about. Brandon, would you like to summarize this one?
I would, because this is actually one of my favorites in this entire collection. It's about a group of 4 Pachucos, or essentially a small, gang of Mexican Americans, traveling outside the border wall during an invasion of aliens that everyone calls chupacabras, as they're now beginning to discover not only where they came from, but that a coalition of soldiers from the US and Mexico have come together to attempt to eradicate them with a nuclear bomb, and all of those soldiers are now dead. So these Pachucos have now decided that they're going to go on a suicide mission solely to use this opportunity to try to claim a level of independence for the area that they've come from, and try to distance themselves from the conflict and segregation that surrounds the area. And I thought that was really neat. I thought not only were the characters very engaging for such a very short story, but I thought that premise, that theme of a group of essentially kind of lowly characters taking on a suicide mission in order to secure a place for their families and their neighborhood away from the kinds of politics that are tied up into war and conflict was actually kind of cool.
Yeah, you have these characters who are kind of looked down upon, and at least culturally from what I understand as I looked a little more into it. And so it sort of shows them in a moment of shining and empowerment, I guess. And so that was all done in a way that was very it was just exciting and adventurous, kind of a story. And the one thing I really appreciated about this in terms of the translation, or I guess it is written in English originally, but it includes a lot of untranslated Spanish terms in it. And so some of those I was familiar with, some of them were completely new to me and I had to look up, but I appreciated that those were kept in to not just provide mood, but also to educate.
I actually want to go one step further and say that I appreciate that they're there because language is very important in stories, obviously. And I feel like a large part of why this collection exists is because there is a lot of kind of dismissal of Spanish and like Spanish dialect in fiction in general and science fiction in particular. And the fact that not only do a lot of these stories keep them, but that this story is kind of full of that language because these characters are code switching around each other on a regular basis is actually really enlivening in this story, not only to let us know that these are actual people who are talking in the way that we would expect them to talk, but because for want of a better way of putting it, if another editor had found this story, they would have probably cut those words out because they didn't know what they meant.
Exactly.
So even if I didn't, I appreciated being given an opportunity to learn rather than being cut out from that experience.
Right. I really enjoyed this story too. It's very lively, and as Daniel said, the characterization is very effective in a short amount of space to watch these friends or tight little unit that figures out what happened, figures out how to hack into the military net so that they can broadcast what they're doing so that the Americans can't claim the final credit for doing this when they are taking over the mission. It was an enjoyable story, and as you both have said, I really enjoyed how they did the code switching and, the language so that you were reading in translation, but you still knew the origin of what you were reading. So, yeah, good story. Okay, so the next in the collection is A Truth Universally Accepted by Skiffy and Fanty's own Julia Rios. And I believe what it says in my e-copy is Traducción de Patricia Coral. And I don't know if that means that Patricia translated it, but that would be my guess.
Yeah, I believe she translated into the Spanish then, for the Spanish edition.
All right. This is a story about someone traveling through reality shifts because she is trying to fix a broken relationship. And she meets up with a friend who she has made she gave a homing device to her friend Osmundo in her own reality, and so she keeps keying into him when she goes to meet up with him when she goes into a new reality, but he's not, it's a third person that she is trying to get back together with. So Carrie, the main character, is at first you get toward the end before you find out that the you she keeps talking about, I don't think she ever names who this person is that she is trying to get back together with, but that person was in each reality they break up for various reasons. In this story, the final thing is that this person was a conservative Christian who wanted our character Carrie to go through conversion therapy, and that they have they have a spiritual connection, she says. And Carrie realizes that all this reality switching is really not helping her, and it's time to go face her own reality and just deal with the breakup. I've seen quite a few stories along the lines of trying to fix breakups, either through time travel or reality hopping. This was a well-done version. I don't know that I got a whole lot out of this story that I haven't already encountered in other stories, but maybe it struck a chord with one of you more than it did with me.
It did, a little bit. If only because, like, I do think that there is value, however small, in telling a version of those kinds of trying to fix a relationship through science fiction shenanigans stories, where the protagonist comes to the acknowledgement that this doesn't make things better, rather than some serendipitous thing finally saves the relationship. I appreciate that kind of acceptance, and I feel like part of the reason why I accept it is because Osmundo is there, and because essentially what the story is implying to us is that she always has essentially somebody that she can talk to about it every time that it happens, which is actually kind of neat and endearing to me, that the underlying implication of the story isn't about trying to fix it or just coming to a realization without that experience, but that part of how you gain that kind of understanding that a relationship is over and that you should move on is by having people that you can trust. And that is a realization she has because she trusts Osmundo with her literal reality.
Yes, so this struck a really big positive chord with me, in part because as soon as it started getting into the second person reference, because the Carrie is basically writing it or relating it directed to to the girlfriend. And that immediately, for me, I really have difficulty reading things in the second person, even when the story overall is from the first person perspective. But it was kept at a minimum enough for me to move past that, thankfully, because I really did enjoy it a lot. I don't know, I might not be as widely read to have encountered this kind of story as much, but also I ended up feeling like it wasn't necessarily about fixing the relationship or coming to just the idea alone of that one needs to move on from something. That is definitely true, but I also read in it a theme of ultimately being about oneself, and that for most of it, it's about how her relationship, either Carrie's or her girlfriend's relationship with her, have been defined by others. Others view it as something that is wrong, that you need conversion therapy for. She's defining her existence now based on the relationship that they had or what might have been. And this realization that how others define you as opposed to just accepting how you define yourself and what you consider yourself to be, ultimately being a realization that that's the most important. And the appreciation that her friend, Osmundo, is like the one person that does then say, like, well, what do you want? How do you see this? Is concerned for her, but at the same time seems to give more worth in her own self-realization, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really do like that relationship with the friend, Osmundo. He tells her that she's being kind of crazy to try to get back together, but he supportively goes with her, to the coffee shop to help out his good friend. And so that was very nice. It was a good story, and certainly, given the message we get in a lot of media, TV and film, where you are told that if you just keep persisting, keep trying, keep almost stalking, that your relationship will work out if you just try hard enough. And I think it's very valuable to hear stories where you realize that the right thing to do is let go. The next story, Matashin, by Felicia Caton Garcia, is one of the difficult ones that I had to read a couple of times, and it didn't help me entirely understand the story.
Both this one and the next one, I thought a lot of these stories have occurred in kind of pairs to me in some way. Like two that were kind of funny and humorous. These were the two that were hard to figure out exactly what was happening in them, plot-wise. And so both of them ended up conveying to me more like moods or kind of overarching themes as opposed to any plot narrative. But this one particular, I read it 3 times now, I think, and I'm still not quite certain. So
yeah. So just for a general description of things that happen, there's not really a linear plot in this one. The narrator starts out talking about her friend Lena, who says that perspective is more important than truth, and there's no difference between translation and interpretation. And the narrator says that's wrong. Sometimes one thing is true and other versions are not, and it doesn't matter who's telling the story. And there's a little discussion about Lena talking about an article she read about abuse and gaslighting, but she won't talk about her own bruises. Then they talk about Madashins, which are costumed dancers who play historical roles, and the narrator talks about how this is kind of like what they're doing with their device, which is bearing the weight of theory, and she never really explains what it is doing, but apparently it's some kind of world-changing thing, and the lab that she works out has been taken over by other people, and she talks about Moses sending spies into Canaan, and then she says, anyway, changes are being made. Ask me the right question now, and you'll understand everything that came next. So, it is not a plot that explains things are happening. It's a plot that gives mood pictures, I guess, and lets you know something is important, but I'm pretty sure you're not supposed to understand what's happening, just that this person is coming, or has come, to a resolution and set something big in motion that's going to change a lot of things. I thought it was interesting. I read it twice, but, I don't get the feeling that it's a translation problem. I think it's just shaped deliberately nebulously.
I agree, and that I thought that was a really good description, actually. That was far better than I could. So yeah, they seem to be, I guess they were physicists? Right? It was a physics lab.
Yes.
And I was thinking that somehow they were working on something that was like somehow involved time and the perspective through different points of time or different points of view through time, but maybe that's not correct.
It could be about time travel. It could be about some even more fundamental change in reality that's coming. I just couldn't tell. Time is possible, but maybe it's something else.
The most I could read from it, at least, was kind of like you said, a mood piece that sort of meditates on aspects of what truth is and how one gets truth from various perspectives. And whether there really is something, does the perspective not matter? Is something just is, no matter who's viewing it, and some people might just be wrong? Or are there sorts of different ways of looking at things? That initial conversation, maybe because it started at the beginning, that kind of colored my reading of the rest of it as well then, too.
Mm-hmm. It reminded me a little bit of Ted Chiang's story, The Truth of Fact, The Truth of Feeling, from several years ago, where everyone could get memory recorders installed into their brains and then, call back how a conversation actually happened, as opposed to the emotional truth of what you felt happened during that conversation.
One of the things that I think kind of struck with me as part of this story, because I do tend to agree with you both about the piece as a mood piece, but a part of the reason why I appreciate it is because it spends a lot of time talking more or less about what they're doing without that thing actively happening on the page. So I guess part of the confusion is because we don't see exactly what is being done, it feels like a thing is happening. It feels like we're missing a thing. but I kind of appreciated it more as a kind of observation about, as you say, how perspective shapes the way that we see the events that have taken place around us. And I thought it was particularly interesting that it spends a lot of time talking about history, but always talking about history in the sense that they're attempting to document things or referring to things that have already been documented, but there is still some sense of that history is just the story that has been told, which kind of made the ending of the story kind of more resonant for me as a result. That there is this sense of some other way to approach the story that is presently in front of us that shapes the way that we consider the events that we've seen and heard in it.
Yeah, that's a great insight that now that I'm thinking about, and you say that fits well with the title of the piece, and sort of that symbolism of the Matashin dancers, because their dancing is now, as I understand it, a re-embodiment of a history. And so it's telling something that already exists, in a way, retelling it. The other thing I wanted to say about this was that the author, from what I can tell, has previously published poetry for the most part. And so I didn't find that surprising after I looked into it, after reading it, that was the case, because the language is beautiful. And also that I believe it's actually an excerpt from a novel.
Oh.
And so I'm very curious now to see, is the whole novel kind of this style? Or is this just sort of, do you learn much more about what's going on, or about a plot, as it were, in the larger work, if this is indeed just an excerpt?
Well, that would certainly change things if the mystery about what's going on is because of it being an excerpt rather than a deliberate choice for the story structure, which is what I had assumed.
I had equally considered the fact that it was an excerpt from a longer piece of work, but I feel like that actually makes it stronger and more standout in terms of this interpretation as a result, because it meant that Felicia Caton Garcia, and perhaps with the effort of the editors as well, deliberately sought out an excerpt that kind of fulfilled some thematic level, and that the fact that thematic exploration was about how interpretation shapes the way that we envision a story actually makes it more interesting to me, because either that's a thing that is core to that text which really interests me in that novel, or they just so happened to be this uncut section of text that perfectly explores that by itself, that just so happened to be there present for them to find. And it makes me, both of those things make me more intrigued to see, what that longer thing is, and to see, more prose from Garcia as well. Precisely because it kind of digs into more ambiguous thematic exploration, while being part of something that we would typically assume gives us direct information in a way that we can actually follow narratively.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would definitely be interested in tracking down more from Garcia, either if there's more of this work, or reading some of the poetry, because this was definitely one of the pieces in the book that made me think the most. In a good way.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so the next story is Contract, that's spelled KAN/TRAHC, by Ileana Vargas, translated by Adrian Demopoulos.
It's a story that tells us to make sure you read the contract. That is the take-home message that I got from it.
That's, yeah.
It's another one where, to me, there was no plot, per se, at least not a linear kind of plot, but more it's a character in a situation, and again with very poetic language, describing sort of a horrific experience for that character that you eventually see is a medical treatment that the character has signed off on. And it was unclear to me whether it's basically the character completely losing coherence through death, or whether it was something dead being sort of recohered back together, or if it was going in both directions. But it's just, the story sort of exudes the feeling of like desperation that one has when this is your last, like you desperately want something and you view this as your last hope. And what you might do and sacrifice to make that hope, or like make that hope something that happens. But then also feeling a bit of regret that it's come to this, and that it's not necessarily a good experience that you've done this. That's the best I can do, at least, to explain it. But I really enjoyed it a lot, just from that it was very effective at conveying those emotions to me.
Yeah, I think there were a couple of different incapacitations going on for the voice in the story. There's the medical experiment thing that you talk about, which is definitely disturbing. There's also that the problem that signing up for this thing was ostensibly to solve is, as far as I can tell, the white noise of advertisements and overstimulation by constant media bombardment. And this, I think the person thought that they were signing up for something that would allow them to cohere what they are experiencing, so to develop an ear that will filter out the white noise so that life can be bearably focused again. And there was also the thing that they started out with. The narrator starts out talking about the worst fear, they said, is that which is feared improperly. And I believe that the they there is referring to the invaders or salesmen or whoever is doing this medical treatment thing. And apparently they are the one who decide what is improperly feared, not the people who are anticipating or undergoing the fearsome thing. So it was a disturbing story, but a very interesting one.
One of the things that I thought was particularly interesting thematically was the fact that, in a kind of roundabout sense, the pieces are kind of obvious discussion about obviously reading the fine print and like knowing what consequences you're actually signing up for when you take life-changing medical procedures, for instance. But the consequence of those decisions was loss of verbal coherence. And the piece itself does a lot of stylistic effort to actually show us what that means for the character. Because they fluctuate from points of increased verbosity as a result of procedure to losing control of the messages that they're sending. I thought that was actually particularly interesting. Not only thematically, but visually, because a lot of those decisions were like very easy in terms of just manipulating words, but were very effective.
Yeah, I don't know if there's an audiobook version of this, but this is one of the stories that I definitely feel is better experienced through text than it would be in audio.
Or at least it would change drastically as a result to translate it to sound. But I actually think that would also be particularly interesting, but it would probably not resemble this as closely as it's being read.
Moving along, since some of these stories won't need as much discussion, but we do have quite a few more to get through. So, The Binder by Angela Lujan. Briefly, A kid needs to get a binder for school. His mom is taking him home from getting that. A man tries to steal it. The kid kicks him to get it back. And the next day he leaves school to fight crime. He meets a guy called the Blockbuster Bandit, who does not steal from Blockbuster, but tries to guard Blockbuster and former Blockbuster sites. And he creates his own binder costume, goes through some stuff, and decides to focus only on preventing theft of binders, because otherwise it's all too overwhelming. And it was a playful thing, very much in the voice of a child, I thought, or an early teen. And, silly, but quite fun to experience.
I similarly thought that it was actually kind of charmingly funny. When I read it the first time, it felt like I was kind of disconnected from it, because after you go through a lot of particularly meaningful and significant work, you kind of go into the next story thinking, oh, maybe a thing is happening and you're not noticing. And then I just read it as it was, and it was just like hearing a story from your cousin or something like that, and I thought that was really sweet.
I thought it was a nice break after the rather harrowing previous story.
Yeah, talk about a 180-degree turn. Yeah, this was just a riot to me. It was really funny and it was really witty. I adored the way it ended with the lines that all kind of rhymed together, which would be interesting to see how they translated that then too. Or was this one written in Spanish? No, this is one that was not translated in the English edition. So written in English, translated into Spanish for the other, I imagine. I also just appreciated the sort of one of the overall messages of it, even though it's funny and sort of lighthearted, that it sort of points out the dangers of being a generalist. And sort of the virtues of sometimes it's worth focusing on just minutia or having your little niche and sticking to it. And if you try to go outside of that niche, you might, that might not necessarily be good. And so it's not bad to be focused on something. And then also it's sort of touched again, which a lot of the stories did, I thought, of sort of perspective of how others see you versus how you sort of spin yourself, what you take as your identity compared to how others might, like with the Blockbuster Bandit, of viewing themselves as a protector of blockbusters, but their name, when everybody hears it, they think, oh, well, you steal from blockbusters. It was just a really clever way to deal with those ideas.
Okay, next is another story from a child's point of view, Ring a Roses, by Raquel Castro, translated by Ruth Clark. A kid gets a zombie for his birthday. He takes it to school. It eats people, eats kids and teachers until the mom makes him leave the zombies at home. And that's about it for the story. The kid does not go through any moral qualms or anything, which is very disturbing.
Was it a young boy or was it a young girl?
Don't think it's important to the story, but
I guess it isn't. That's true. that is certainly true.
I don't remember. I may have just assumed point of view. I'm not sure.
I enjoyed it a lot. It's pretty simple. Even the theme of it, I guess, is also, it's funny because as the child is up to this, not realizing that there's anything wrong with it, as children are disappearing from the school, none of the adults seem to even notice that this is occurring or seem bothered by the fact that some of the students are now zombies. And so it's not a new idea that adults are oblivious to the world of children. But this was sort of a fun way in a short tale to do that.
Right. Okay, and the next story in the collection, Shoot by Pepe Rojo, is also a zombie story. This is a sort of free association, monologue of a guy who codes some kind of zombie game. And also is addicted to it, and his life is falling apart, and things keep happening, and he says, meanwhile, I kill zombies. This one didn't really do much for me, I must confess.
Sadly, I am inclined to say the same. I feel like the free association of the text probably appears more poetic in Spanish translation. But as it stands right now, it just feels like a kind of straightforward approach to what is otherwise kind of not particularly engaging or active life. I wanted to say that that's perhaps the goal, but I'm not sure if that makes it more engaging as a result. Just more thematically in point.
Yeah, I'm with that pretty much 100%. I can see the goal, I can see how the style kind of fits with that, but I could not get much enjoyment or interest out of it, both in the way it was written and sort of beyond that point of being sort of a criticism of, or an engagement of people's addiction to first-person shooter games and such. Didn't get much more out of it.
And I mean, I guess I want to be particularly generous that I think accomplishing that thematic beat is still valuable, but I feel like there was a way to make that more interesting on the page while still accomplishing that kind of deadened, disconnected kind of atmosphere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's not without worth, but, yeah.
Okay, next, It All Makes Sense Here by Alberto Chimal, translated by Jesse Ward.
So, I'm going mostly from memory here and just some very vague notes that I made to myself. But as I recall, the story basically starts with some people watching video that has turned viral that effectively shows a violent clown gang doing something violent to others, and so gets into a discussion then of monsters and people's fear of monsters and why people like watching this and seeing that, you know, bad shit happens to other people. It sort of gives us comfort then that, you know, it's not happening to us, somebody else is getting mutilated out there. And at the same time, in this fashion with this, like, you know, this clown gang in a very visible sort of absurd way that's, I wouldn't say celebrated, but it's very well advertised. I guess that's the word I'm looking for. And it's gone viral, or this video is out there. And then as the characters sort of go their separate ways after having considered this, you see there's another character that then basically is observing them and then goes off on their own home. And this other character, nondescript, normal person, goes home and goes down into their basement where they have a bunch of people. They have no idea who they are. They just pick them up and have basically taken them to their basement to torture and to presumably kill or do other awful things to.
Right. This is another story that was not terribly appealing to me. I thought the most interesting part was the middle, where they were talking about why people like to enjoy, you know, creepypasta and, you know, horror videos and things like that. And, you know, you can tell yourself, well, I wouldn't do X, so I wouldn't be in that situation. So you can comfort yourself that, you know, you have control in your world. But, you know, those, I would just as soon read an actual paper about something like that. I didn't think that the conversation between the editor and the reporter, you know, format was really, you know, it was not terribly illuminative to me. So this was not a story that grabbed me.
It may be because I've read a few stories by Chimal now in the last months doing the speculative fiction translation with Rachel. And so there's been several of his that have been available recently. And they all have this sort of consistent style where they're just trying to make one little point that's somewhat almost like in a Twilight Zone way. There's a twist at the end or some insight they're making into human nature. And I agree with you that the way that discussion is handled is somewhat awkward. It's not an info dump, but it does similarly to what info dumps kind of get the bad rap for, of just kind of serving the purpose of we need to discuss this philosophy in here to make our final point in the story. But at the same time, I thought it was an interesting and a valid point that the sort of created visible monsters that we all celebrate and that we watch and we advertise sort of flamboyantly allow us to very easily ignore the real ones that do exist and forget that the real ones are often silent and aren't as readily visible, and can be much more damaging than the ones sort of that make stories up about, or that might be well televised or well shared, and that people get lulled into sort of a false sense of comfort through that, not really realizing that there's much worse things out there. And I ended up, I guess, because of the collection that this is, I also ended up reading that symbolically as just like a political statement too, that we're often in more affluent parts of the world. We watch these movies about situations or horrors, but then forget about sort of what terrible things happen in the world just in general, not killers per se, but just wars and terrible, genocides throughout the world. And certain ones sort of flamboyantly gets celebrated in the media, whereas other ones are just completely not talked about, and sort of happening underneath this veil of disinterest or not realizing that they actually are occurring. And so I thought that was an interesting observation. And so Shamal seems to have these observational kind of human nature type stories that appeal to me, but I totally get what you're saying too, Trish.
Yeah, I think that point you just talked about is an interesting and worthwhile topic, but I didn't really feel like this story was the most effective way to express that.
I tend to agree. I actually kind of liked Twilight Zone-esque twist, but mostly for its own sake rather than whether it was actually fulfilling its theme as strongly as it could have. I just kind of appreciated that it was there, but I do feel like it could have been better presented or done a little bit more exploration. I'm not sure what, but the way that I appreciated it wasn't perhaps the very cap that I could have appreciated it at.
Mm-hmm. Okay, next. Music and Petals by Gabriella Damian Miravete. Translated by Megan Berkobian. And this is from a girl's point of view. And she is afraid of the basement because of the music that she hears in it. But later on in the story, it turns out that also she's being abused in this basement when her brother takes her down there. And also, there are neighbors who come in, and it turns out that the wife of this family, this new family, is actually the daughter of a former employee of the family, and at some point she gets the girl over and gives her hot chocolate, and we find out later that she drugs her, although that doesn't seem to go anywhere. And she explains that the girl's father drugged the neighbor lady's father and got him in the basement and then raped and killed the neighbor lady's mother. And then the girl goes home, and unless I missed something, that was just an awful story that she got told by the neighbor lady. I thought the neighbor lady was going to do some horrible revenge thing. But apparently not. But then the girl's brother hits on the neighbor lady and is rejected, and then he goes and tries to rape his sister again, and she kills him. And the mother meets the girl at the basement steps with a shovel and a sack of cement. So obviously she knew what was going on and just hadn't done anything about it. So I really don't know what this story is trying to tell us, except that abuse is bad.
I want to say that, I guess part of the reason why I, personally, kind of emotionally, couldn't really, kind of really engage with this story is because I feel like telling stories like that, just to say that that is bad, is, not perhaps the kind of thing, at least that I find, strong connection with. I don't think that, I feel like there are potential ways that could be well done, but I feel like there was some kind of disconnect there, in part because it felt a great deal of the time like it, just dipped into, abject hopelessness in a way that made me feel like the ultimate message was the only escape is through, desperate violence. And I'm not sure how I feel about all of that.
Yeah, I couldn't really tell any reason why she wouldn't have told her mother what was going on, except that the mother just seems so oblivious. Well, she does say, my mom has a tough life, I don't want to make things harder on her by telling her about this abuse that I'm going through.
I want to say that I get where that character is coming from in terms of those, decisions, but I feel like there were perhaps other things that could have, also come up in that space that could have led to some more challenging, more complex, more valuable end than just experiencing it again until violence happens. I'm not sure. I don't want to feel like I'm coming down on this story, because I also want to be hopeful that part of the reason why it's here is because it was attempting to approach something more complicated and something more valuable, but I feel like this wasn't that thing.
This story reminded me of something that perhaps one might see in Nightmare magazine, in terms of style and execution to some degree. The focus was really just on horror and describing something disturbing and horrific in a lot of ways, I ran into difficulty with it beyond the appreciation of it for being horror and being very good at establishing mood and sort of this dark ambience about the down under, as she calls the basement, is that you're left with more questions that you both are kind of referring to, of it's not clear what exactly the neighbor's goals are here. She seems to know about the family secrets, but is she telling this because she wants the same result to happen as has had in the past, of, punishment for the evildoer? The mother definitely knows more about what happened in the past and what's going on now with the brother and sister than she's willing to deal with. And so is it about the girl sort of coming to that realization herself and taking the initiative and the power to defeat that? I found it interesting in the end. There's body imagery of the girl actually becoming something else as she punishes and ends the use of the brother. But I ended up with more questions and uncertainties even by the end, that made a lack of resolution to the story.
And the final text story in the collection is Clean Air Will Smell Like Silver Apricots, written and translated by Andrea Chapella, and edited by Kelsey Venata.
Sure. So I thought this was a really sweet kind of way to end the collection, particularly after the previous very dark story. This one was really sweet and hope-filled. Still melancholy, but much very sweet. And so the idea of the story is that a girl is taking care of a ginkgo tree in a pot outside, giving it nourishment, but ultimately knows that she has to then take it to the forest reserve, where there's many ginkgo trees with plaques on them, and you begin to realize that it's a bit of a memorial. And effectively that this girl's father has died in an accident, a car accident, and the ashes of the father have now been put in with the soil, and as a biologist, it connected me with Rhizome, the comic following this now that I hear what that was about. It fits in sort of the order of the narratives here, the order of the stories, that the father, the biology of the father, those ashes become part of the soil, the minerals, the carbon that ultimately goes to growing these trees. And so this forest is a memorial forest, ultimately, where her father still lives on. Her father has become a ginkgo tree. So it's not a story with much complexity to it, I wouldn't say, but it was a beautiful story.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's not a complex story, but it's very well told, and despite the melancholy, there is hope because the ginkgo terraforming is helping to heal the environment. And, there's obviously a society-wide concerted effort to be working on that problem. It's a very, very nice little story.
That at that point I actually forgot, because as I was reading it, I was thinking, well, plants aren't very good at that. It's the microbes that are actually going to be doing the remediation. And so that was my bias.
Well, she's a little girl. She's been told that the ginkgo trees are doing it, so.
I did think that was like one of the sweeter parts of the story, that there is this cultural ritual that she is engaging in. Like, that is the level under which she is aware of what's happening. But that there is this, like, greater effort being made by that process that I thought was a really good kind of thought experiment. Like, how do you ritualize other ways that we can engage with the environment in certain ways while still making that like about us and about the other cultural things that we value, like family, like memorializing those who have passed, etc.
Right. Of course, today you can plant a memorial tree for anyone that passes on, but in this future story there's more integration with that, and so yeah, it was a really nice note to end the text collection, as I said, and then the rhizome after that was just another very nice story in graphic form.
And as Daniel has pointed out with all of these stories previously, this story does make a pretty good emotional tonal pair with Rhizome. It's like that kind of segmentation of the collection in terms of a series of otherwise vastly different but still emotionally and contextually alike stories, kind of in the hope that as you read you will always like gravitate toward at least half of the collection. There will still be a good chunk of things that you like, because if you are in favor of a mood, or if you're in favor of a certain kind of thematic question, they've given you another chance to find something that you might find engaging.
Yeah.
Right. I've said there are several stories that didn't appeal to me, but there were other stories that really did appeal to me, and some that left me kind of baffled, but that I want to keep reading a few more times and challenging me in a good way. Okay, well, I'd like to thank our listeners for traveling on this journey through the anthology with us, and if you if you haven't read it, certainly by all means go on the website that'll be in the show notes and get your own free copy of the ebook and dip into it. There's just a lot of stuff in here that is interesting. And thank you, co-hosts Daniel and Brandon.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for leading.
As always, it's been an interesting discussion with y'all.
Seeing an awkward ending.
If you would like to support this show, you can go to patreon.com/SkiffyandFanty or find us on Twitter @SkiffyandFanty, our webpage skiffyandfanty.com, or you can even send us an email at skiffyandfanty@gmail.com. The intro music for this podcast was taken from Rock Thing by Creo. You can find out more about their music on freemusicarchive.org.